Good morning, everyone. We are going to continue on with the history of world slavery. You should have already watched the video of slavery and social death, and that should give you some theoretical understanding of the difference between perceiving a person as a human being, an individual with rights, and then a human, an individual, a being who doesn't have any rights. One is a social human being, and the other one has been rooted out and has become or suffered a social death. So they have no standing within the society itself. And I've given you some of the theoretical background that ties in with both Orlando Patterson and Max Weber, the one where they both talk about power and how power works and operates. So you should have some theoretical understanding of that. Now what I want to do is talk about world slavery and do it from a transnational or transworld perspective, so you can get an idea that slavery existed everywhere. Most people today in the world believe that slavery only occurred from Africa to the Americas or Africa to places like Brazil, but that's not true. Whites, Asians, everybody was caught up in the slave trade all over the world. It was an international problem or an international institution. Slavery was seen as something as natural as drinking water or breathing air. Most societies had slaves, not all, but most societies. So to sit there and to think that one group of people were enslaved and my group was not enslaved is a total misunderstanding and a total misunderstanding of history and a false reading of history, or just the ignorance of history itself and slavery exists. So what we want to do is appreciate the history of world slavery, and I'm going to describe slavery across times. I'm going to give you some more intellectual bases of slavery and then tie in some economics as well. Now, some of these early conceptions of slavery we can take from Aristotle, who was born in 384 BC, who would end up writing, from the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjection and others for rule. And so what Aristotle here basically is saying is that the world is essentially divided between those who are enslaved and those who are not. The world divided between masters and slaves, those who dominate and those who are dominated. So we can see from 300 years, 400 years, even before the birth of Christ, people were understanding and conceptualizing slavery, all right, including the Greeks. Now, what is slavery? Well, it depends. If we look at Webster's dictionary, it says submission to a dominating influence, or practically the practice of holding someone against their will. I know that these are false definitions of slavery because they don't account for the nuances. So, for example, submission to a dominating influence, by enrolling in classes, you're submitting yourself to a dominating influence. And that's the professor in the institution of college, or the people, the state that passes out the degrees. So that one can't be right. Or what about a child who is dominated by its parents? Is that child a slave? Or the practice of holding someone against their will. What about prisoners? Are prisoners slaves? Well, technically, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, you could say from the 14th or 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, it says, well, yeah, this slavery is abolished except for those who were incarcerated. But really, does that really holding someone against their will? What about someone who's being held a hostage? Would that person be a slave? Well, you might say, well, someone is dominating them, so therefore, but you know intuitively that doesn't make sense, right? So we know those definitions don't work. So we have to come up with a new definition. I take my definition from the 1926 Slavery Convention of Geneva in Switzerland that reads, and I quote, "Slavery is the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. This works better for me because it's saying that slavery is a status and a condition. So you can be labeled a slave or you could be treated as a slave of a person whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership or are exercised. So what I am saying here, or what the Slavery Convention is saying here, is that slavery is a byproduct of status, being labeled, or by condition, right? So the milieu that you find yourself in. And then if you have all of your powers or rights of ownership are being exercised on you by another person, that in of itself is slavery. And you should have a working definition right now of what ownership is, what a human is, person, and what power is. We just talked about that. Okay, so where did slavery come from? Its origins are unknown. We don't really know who started slavery or where it came from. We kind of have this idea that the domestication of animals gave people the idea that they could then enslave people. That's about a pretty good guess. No conclusive evidence, but that's what we go with. Earliest known laws recognizing slavery, we can find some of those in the Hammurabi Code, dating from Mesopotamia, going back almost 2,000 years before Christ. Now, slavery was found in all societies, whether it's China, Egypt, India, Persian societies, Mesopotamia, Africa, classical Greece and Rome, the Islamic world, the New World, Native Americans. Everybody had slaves. So the notion, again, that black people or maybe Native Americans were enslaved by the Europeans, the conquistadors, or whomever, that's a false notion. The Aztecs had slaves, right? The conquistadors had slaves. Everybody has slaves of their own people, right? Or the neighboring people. So black slavery was a rather new phenomenon in the world. Now, the Greeks had the first true slave society beginning some 600 years before the birth of Christ. And these were true slave societies. And usually how we demarcate what's a slave society and not a slave society is just the amount of slaves that are in that society and how dependent are the people on those slaves. So what we can have is slave societies where the vast majority of the people in those societies are slaves and they're keeping the societies running, like Greek society, or a society with slaves, where you have a small number of slaves, like in most Native American societies, small numbers, about 10%, and they don't necessarily help keep the community working. If the slaves were to disappear, the society would keep moving. In a true slave society, if the slaves were to disappear, the whole society would fall apart. Right? At the time of Jesus, there were about 2 to 3 million slaves in the Roman Empire, and they made up about 40% of the population. That is basically a slave society. In Dutch Manhattan, around 1644, about 40% of the population was slaves, so that again is a slave society, and that number won't drop off until many years later. The Indians of the Pacific Northwest had about 10% of their population was enslaved. So that is a society with slaves, not a slave society. Now, where does the word slave come from? Well, we take it from the word Slav, coming from Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was synonymous with slavery in the sense that people from Western Europe came into Eastern Europe and took slaves or took people as slaves. In many cases, many of the slaves in Western Europe were in fact sold or given to the Islamic Empire in the def sherme system, where they could be taken in, reared, and educated. This was done by many Eastern European families because they just couldn't afford to educate and clothe and feed their own children. So they gave their young boys into the def sherme system, into the Islamic society, so they could become educated. Now, these individuals were slaves, but they served functions and they were able to have some really high and distinguished positions within the Islamic society, but it was still slavery. Now, slavery flourished in the Middle Ages from 400 to 1500 AD, And this is largely due to the rise of the bourgeois class, a new rising merchant class of individuals who are building their wealth on trade. And so these people may not necessarily be part of the aristocracy through Europe. These are, some cases, non-aristocratic individuals who have made wealth. These individuals desire new goods and slaves. So they brought into, especially Western Europe, Greeks, Armenians, Russians, Bulgarians, Turks, Slavs, Arabs, Africans, Chinese, Tatars, you name it. All of these people were brought into Western Europe and put under slavery. Okay? Now, how is slavery different from other forms of labor? Slaves are essentially, as we talked about, property that can be bought and sold, leased, traded, just like livestock. They are always vulnerable to sexual exploitation and cruel punishment. Unlike a worker who is in a free labor system, you're not necessarily going to have this kind of sexual exploitation or cruel punishment from your employer. At least you shouldn't. And if that's the case, you can leave your employment or get discharged by your employer or seek other employment or even, file some complaint or something. But under slavery, you are someone else's property, and most likely you will be sexually exploited, and most likely you will be punished, probably rather severely. This is the very nature of slavery. Now, kingdoms like the Roman Empire, or empires like the Roman, were heavily dependent upon slavery, just like the Greeks. Most of the slaves in the Roman Empire were in the countryside, working on small farms, which were later replaced by larger slave plantations. Most of these slaves in Rome served wealthy Roman citizens. They also, slaves with talent commanded the highest prices. So if you were let's say, a singer, jeweler, physician, maybe even a legal person, you would have commanded a higher price at market than, say, just an ordinary laborer. In the Roman Empire, you could eventually get your freedom and become a citizen. It didn't always happen, but it was a possibility. Roman law was immensely inconsistent on slavery, where slaves would have more rights in some cases than others, depending upon your status as a slave. So in the Roman Empire, slaves even had statuses, and anyone could be a slave. It did no distinction of color, race, religion, or sex. Remember, Rome was a multicultural society, and they enslaved everyone. Whites, blacks, it didn't matter. What was valued was Roman citizenship, not your skin color. Okay? In the Islamic world, people described slavery as more humane than, let's say, European slavery. That's not really true. That's a fiction. It was equally cruel. As I stated earlier, the Islamic society had a thing called the Defsherme system, where they would literally bring in boys as young as 9 years old, and they would train them, re-educate them, teach them Arabic, teach them the ways of their religion, Islam. And these individuals then would be, the more tougher kids would be brought into the Janissary Corps, the military. The more intellectual ones would be trained as government officials, that sort of thing. So the beauty of the system is that these individuals had no other loyalty but to the caliph or the king, I suppose. So that was the beauty of that system. The bad part about this is that many of these individuals who were brought in were turned into eunuchs. They were castrated. So I'll give you an example. In the 10th century, the Caliph of Baghdad had about 11,000 of these eunuchs that were brought in, that they essentially, they were slaves, but they were also castrated. There was also sexual exploitation of these women. Vast numbers of these women slaves in the Islamic world were women, and of course they were sexually exploited. Let's talk just for a minute about the individuals that were famous in slavery, to give you some kind of idea about the wide, vast net that slavery cast. Aesop, 1620 to 1560 BC, and you should know him from Aesop Fables. Spartacus, you've probably been watching Spartacus on TV, as a gladiator who led a slavery revolt in the Roman Empire, 73 to 71 BC. This was the Third Servile War. There is a number of individuals like Marcus Tullius Tiro, who was the secretary for the most famous orator in all of Rome, Cicero. He was the first modern court reporter. There is Pope Calixtus I, who was Pope of the Catholic Church from 217 to 222. There was St. Patrick, who was actually born in Britain, captured and sold into slavery to Ireland, escapes and goes to France and becomes a monk, and later establishes Christianity in Ireland. He is Ireland's favorite saint. All of these individuals that I just mentioned were slaves. So you can see from that is that slavery was just not about poor people in villages or something to that nature. Slavery cast a pretty wide net throughout its entire existence, and many people were in fact captured into the slave trade. Slaves would provide much of the labor power for the settlement in the New World, both in the Central and South Americas with the importation of African slaves, the capturing and enslavement of the indigenous population in the New World, and the movement of slaves into the Caribbean and then into the in North America for the British and the French and others. So they're providing the essential labor power to clear fields, to mine, to do all of the work that's necessary to make those societies wealthy and to make sure that they function. They're going to provide much of the products for the mass consumer movement that's going to begin to sweep the world as capitalism integrates itself into the world. So slavery is going to become part of the earliest multinational system of credit and trades that rose up from the 15th century, propagated itself on throughout the 15th century, and came into its true form. Slavery stimulated other market sectors like shipping. So if you have slaves mining, if you have slaves harvesting crops, these crops need to be shipped. So ships need to be built. Those ships need to be protected from pirates. So you need large navies. Manufacturing, you need to take those raw materials and build factories to turn that cotton, to turn that sugar into cloth and into finished product. So from that standpoint, whole societies will emerge in places like England, whole cities like Liverpool, Bristol. All of these cities will prop up due to the slave trade and the markets that are built from slavery. Guns and munitions making are spurned because these people need to protect their territories, their slaves, and their goods and their money. So you can see from this is that slavery ties in to this early mass movement of capitalism. Wage labor, there are, one, in the New World, in the Americas, not enough people to work. People have a hard time paying wages. They could buy slaves and exploit them with a one-time purchase, and then they could meet their demands for both mining and agriculture and what have you. So from that standpoint, the idea here is that if you bought a slave, you paid a one-time fee, and then you had that slave for life, and you could have minimal amount of fee in supporting that individual. Slavery became one of most profitable industries. At least two-thirds of the British merchant fleet through these time periods was engaged in the slave trade. And through this, everything was traded: fish, oats, corn, lumber, peas, beans, hogs, horses, you name it. All of these goods coming from the Americas are being fed into England and propagated by this slave trade. Now, slavery wasn't wholly responsible for capitalism, obviously, but it's responsible, I argue, for a major creation of it and a major supporting of it. The wealth of a country like France, or the wealth of England, or the wealth of America, or what about even small countries in Northern Europe, Belgium, for example? How would these countries gain their wealth but the exploitation of slave labor? So we get everything from rum, tobacco, coffee, sugar. All of these things are being propagated by slavery. When we get to North American slavery, from Africa, about the vast majority of those slaves would go to the West Indies. 42% of all the African slaves would end up in the West Indies first, and then they would be moved to the Americas. But directly, only about 4% of the slaves made it from Africa to the Americas directly. About 38% of the slaves went to Brazil directly. And if you take out a map and you look at Brazil and Africa, you can see that they are in very close proximity to each other. So from that standpoint, you can see from this that the vast majority of slaves went to the Caribbean and then to Brazil. Just a very small number went to British North America. So you should have right now, this is a pretty good summary of world slavery. You should have some idea that slavery was just not an American thing, an African thing, a Native American thing. It was a worldwide phenomenon.